Good morning and welcome to the webinar on building an information radar with Twitter. My name is John Blue and I work at Truffle Media Networks. We're an agricultural media company focused on animal health issues. This webinar, kind of FYI, this webinar is being recorded and will be published when it's done. We also have a resource support page at radar.hackpad.com. It's a wiki which I'll put in additional information, links, and other resource material definitely through the end of March. Another FYI, if you have to ask a question, type in your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel and I'll address them at designated question points throughout the webinar. Media use over the last 20 years has changed. People have moved from utilizing media based on time and location to discovering and finding information in real time through multiple channels and various sources of authority. Information media has become free, virtual, digital, and very participatory. Today, the way people receive information is far greater than 20 years ago, and there is more noise. So why an information radar? Why is this important? Well, finding out about information on topics or people, businesses are needed many times throughout the day to make decisions. Having a process in place to help identify and highlight trends or events is needed to help get through the swell of data. This slide from Intel, I think in mid-early 2013, highlights what happens in an internet minute. You have no control over that amount. What you do have control over, though, is the way in which you handle the information and data. Just so you know, I mentioned it's from mid-early 2013, so definitely the numbers on the slide are going to probably be higher. It's important to put in place a set of tools and approaches to help. So what is an information radar? Well, the idea of an information radar is already in use today. We have weather, flight, stock, and traffic information. In the form of apps, they collect, organize, and display data to help people make decisions. The information radar that I'm talking about extends on that idea of a single-purpose app like weather, flight, or traffic to an approach whose goal is to help address questions of a specific nature. The information radar topic that I'm focused on is all driven by the initial questions that are being posed or asked. Since this webinar focuses on building an information radar using Twitter, I do want to do a short review on what Twitter is and how it works. Twitter is very simple at its surface. People share things at 140 characters at a time. But there's more than just the 140 character post. For example, in this tweet, there are more than 30 data points that are part of the 140 characters. Some examples include location, the time of the tweet, mentions, favorites, links in the tweet. There are just a few. In addition to the tweet itself, there are a series of users on Twitter. Each one of them has their own set of data: name, information, location, avatar, time zone, etc. There are over 30 different elements for each Twitter user. Additionally, there are other Twitter activities. Twitter's put together an ecosystem that highlights trends, makes recommendations, and offers lists that play a part in the Twitter interactions people have day to day. If you want to learn more about what data Twitter collects along the way, there's a link in the information resource page at radar.hackpad.com. It's called the Twitter Field Guide. It has information on the data, what they can, what is available, how it's formatted, and if you're able to program, how to get it out programmatically. Are there any questions? Okay, well, I don't see any questions yet, so we'll just continue on. As I mentioned, an information radar is driven by the initial questions that have been posed. I'm going to use an example to help get started. In this example, Truffle Media Networks worked in early 2013 with a company called Smart Animal Training Systems, and to help them put in place tools and approaches to understanding the lay of the land in the pet training technology, and they were interested in finding out what's going on in the social web. Just a quick background, Smart Animal Training Systems helps, they actually manufacture a product called Pet Tutor, and its focus is to help provide technologies to pet parents and pet trainers to support positive animal training. So in working with them, there were some things there were some things they were looking for, and these are some of the questions that were initially asked. What are some of the events happening in the pet world? What are some of the leading who are some of the leading voices in pets and pet technologies? Are there some trends? What are some of the media outlets in pet technology space? And are there additional resources or web pages to additional information that Smart Animal Training should pay attention to? So with those questions in mind, we started scanning, looking for what was out there. This process was initially a bit ad hoc, as we didn't really know anything and we weren't sure what we were looking for, but we knew we had these questions. So what we did was we started using Twitter. Knowing nothing about the pet world and social media, used the Twitter search bar to start scanning. Initially just using simple things like the term pet, dog, or cat were used. Right away, we were able to see several tweets that looked promising. This one actually highlighted a hashtag called Global Pet Expo. What was Global Pet Expo? Doing a quick scan on just that hashtag revealed that there was a long set of tweets of a pet product event that was being held in Orlando 2013. So the Global Pet Expo was a major event for people who have pet products to sell. Knowing that, we wanted to go and see, well, what other things are we detecting around that hashtag or other hashtags related to it? And one of those tweets had something even more interesting, this thing called blog pause. What was that about? And looking into that, there was a discovery of a whole community focused around social media and pets. Let me go back real quick. For blog pause, what was really interesting was that this was not just a single site. This was actually a site that has a community of bloggers who blog about pets, pet issues, pet technologies, pet products, their favorite pet tech things. They also talked about dealing with pet social issues, humane society activities, things like that, and they also have an event. There's the Blog Pause event. In 2013, it was held in Washington, D.C. I went and attended that. It was an event that had about 600-700 people attending, plus several hundred dogs and cats, a couple of ferrets, and a bunny or two. So the pets were integrated into the conference itself. And then what they had to help the attendees were events focused around the pets, events focused around the pet parents, and a large exhibit space for vendors and other people to learn more about what's happening in the pet product space. Any questions? I don't see any yet, so I'm going to go ahead and go on. Okay, so we had initially we found the Global Pet Expo information. We had some things around blog pause, and so now we've got some raw data, some information. What do we need to do? What can help long term in help addressing the questions? So what we wanted to do was organize some of the information. So in Twitter, there are things called lists, and this is a way to organize people who are on Twitter into lists, and then you can just look at that list and see what those people are talking about that you've organized. For the Smart Animal Training Systems project, what we did was we looked at the Global Pet Expo hashtag, and we went through about 1,000 tweets by hand, scrolling down, and we were looking at people and the tweets and the comments and saying, hey, are these people interesting? Who are they? And where should they be? And what we did was we created a series of lists focused around media, education, health and wellness, and products. Those were the buckets we accumulated and organized people into. To help for listeners in the webinar, what we did was I put together the two links for that. The top link actually points to the original capture of the Global Pet Expo hashtag. So it's a single web page with 1,000 or so tweets in there, just to give you a sense of what that was like. And then as an example, I put together an example list on the Truffle Media Twitter account called Radar Example, and so that's kind of a small set of what we did on the bigger scale for the Smart Animal Twitter account. Why a list? Well, with a list, I can now go back to it, as I mentioned, and see what's happening for that general collection of people. So in this next slide, this is actually from the Smart Animal Training Systems trainer list, and as you go, you can scroll down and see what the people we've identified as trainers are saying or doing on a regular basis. It's an opportunity just to have a collection of a niche group of people and see if there are topics or issues that they're talking about, and can those people be engaged through responses or comments back on what they're talking about. Now that we have some of the organization, we now need to see if some of the questions are getting answered. So these are the original questions, and some of them actually are being answered. Certainly, there are events in the initial process. We certainly discovered the Global Pet Expo plus the blog pause. While the Smart Animal Training Systems team already knew of specific events that are focused around trainers, they weren't as aware of some of the broader events that talk about pet products. Or the social media and the blog pause one. And so those were really good leads into being able to engage people through different channels, and so that discovery of those events helped them in their business process. Who are some of the leading voices in pets and pet technologies? I think we addressed some of those. That's always an ongoing process. Are there media outlets? Absolutely. So the media list for the Smart Animal Training Twitter account has multiple people in there, and so it's keeping an eye on what they're talking about and looking for opportunities to engage back with the media people on social media on a consistent basis, so that they become more aware about what Smart Animal Training is about. Are there additional web pages and information? Those kind of flowed through. There wasn't anything that answered this definitely. The answer is yes, there are. It's now, are they of value and what can be done with them, and which was a little outside the scope of the initial questions that were posed here. Any questions? So somebody just posted a question that says, how can I tame the information overload on Twitter besides just using lists? That's actually a good question. What I would actually go back to is my initial intro talked about there is so much information, and if you go into just jumping into, say, Twitter and just start reading tweets or tweets from multiple groups, you will get overwhelmed, and that's why being able to quote tame the overload. It's helpful to have a reason to go in and look for something. So having a set of questions is helpful to help narrow down the focus. There's nothing wrong with just reading tweets and just letting things flow by and just from an entertainment point of view. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you feel that there's so much information, you feel compelled to try to read it all, you will burn out and you will get sick of wanting to use Twitter. So that's why having a set of questions to help guide the actions and focus is very important. So hopefully that can help tame the information overload. There are other ways to manage lists, and I'll actually talk about that because that can be helpful too, because just the lists themselves, all that does is it groups a set of people together, but then there's still a lot of information that may be flowing from those lists. And so there are some approaches you can do to manage those lists, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. There's another question that says how to use Twitter effectively for business. Another one says what are some of the best practices for using Twitter for business. In this case, I would say some of the best things that Twitter are geared for is an early and initial discovery of specific information around certain topics. That's a good way to kind of get a sense of what's the pulse of what's going on today. It probably won't answer all things about business because what you're going to do is you're going to have some take away data or take away information, and you're going to go do something else with it. So Twitter is a good lead indicator. It's a good way to discover some initial people. But the next steps would be then, what can I do with that? Are these people I need to meet in person? How do I connect with them? Maybe online, have an interview with them, meet them at an event. Those can help those other processes outside of, say, Twitter, and be in the space of, I'm trying to sell a product, or I'm trying to advocate a cause. I don't see anything else. We're going to go ahead and go on. So to review, excuse me. So to review, questions must lead the process. Defining your questions will help set the tone and direction of whatever activity you're using Twitter for in terms of scanning. The scanning process, as I mentioned, can be a little ad hoc early on, but as long as you have some things that are helping guide your scanning, that's very helpful. Detecting interesting things, that's going to be kind of a mix of eclectic things. You may actually be looking for specific terms, and those questions will help define that. In other cases, for example, the blog pause example, I wasn't looking for blog pause. I just happened to see that as a part of scrolling down, and I saw it several times, so it definitely stuck out, and it had a unique name, and so that was something that was of interest to me. It's always good to summarize for sanity, and the reason for that is you won't be in this alone. You have other people you need to work with. It helps to summarize so that you get rid of all the kind of like the crufty stuff you're not sure about, and you can actually come back to the team and say, here's some things we know. That's why the questions are important, because you can actually come back and say, here's what we know today, here are the questions that aren't getting answered, and here's some things we need to go do later. And then analyze where possible. There are certainly some things you're going to want to look at that are a little bit more deeper, and so the data from Twitter is a good lead point for further analysis. And then you're always aiming to answer your questions. And the short thing here is it's definitely a process. This is not a single shot. It's not the end. Things will change. Certainly questions will change as the business needs change. So I'm going to talk about some tools to help. The initial slides I just went through all relied on using Twitter's standard web interface, and sometimes that can be a bit cumbersome. Excuse me. The following are some tools that can help refine the use of Twitter, or make things easier for you as you're trying to use Twitter for specific things to answer the questions. So I'm going to talk about some scanning tools and detecting tools. So there are two tools I recommend for just general scanning and browsing through Twitter. One of them is TweetDeck, and one of them is Hootsuite. And people always ask me, why TweetDeck or why Hootsuite? And there's a couple reasons. Excuse me. One of them, which is I can have multiple columns. As you notice here in Hootsuite, I can have multiple columns that highlight searches that I'm wanting to keep an eye on. Here are the same search terms, but only in TweetDeck. So being able to see multiple bits of information streaming by is a little bit, it helps from a scanning point of view. The other reason is in both of them you can pre-schedule tweets. So from a management of a Twitter account, it's nice to be able to say, hey, I want to put some stuff on Twitter about a specific topic with this hashtag, but I don't want to do it at 1 o'clock in the morning because the people who would see it are asleep, so I'd rather do it at say 8:30 the next morning. So that's kind of a useful utility from tools like Hootsuite and TweetDeck. And then lastly, multiple accounts can be managed through both of these. Multiple Twitter accounts definitely. Here on the TweetDeck version, I use TweetDeck to manage about 3 or 4 accounts. The same is true for Hootsuite. Hootsuite also has the advantage of being able to manage other types of social media channels like Facebook and Google+. So that's an advantage. Somebody asked, why would one have multiple accounts? That's outside the scope of this presentation, but there are people who have multiple Twitter accounts because they either are helping clients or they're maybe a media company and they have a Twitter account for specific channels that they're trying to get info out. So in our case, Truffle Media has a couple channels: the Truffle Media account, the Swinecast account. Plus, I personally also moderate the some of the ag chat, food chat, so I have access to some of those accounts. So it's helpful to have a tool to manage multiple things like Hootsuite and TweetDeck. So moving on through the tools to help over time, these are not so much tools as they are services that allow you to collect social data over time and then get back some raw data for deeper analysis. And why is that important? For example, collecting tweets from an event can be cumbersome to do. Well, definitely it's hard to do through the Twitter interface and TweetDeck and Hootsuite. Hootsuite, I think, provides some level of support for that, but not very good. And these services, DataSift, GNIP, and ScraperWiki, all have the ability to get some really good, simple interface to capture raw Twitter data. I mentioned an event. I'm going to provide an example of the South by Southwest event that's currently going on in Austin, Texas, and that's an event where there's going to be a lot of tweets. There's no way I personally can manage and look through them all, but these services can capture big chunks of that, and then when I'm ready, I can say, hey, download that file, and then I can analyze it. What are some of the differences? I just want to highlight the differences. DataSift and GNIP, they both have access to Twitter's full data stream, sometimes also referenced as the fire hose. Keep in mind, Twitter has an average of about 6,000 tweets per second, with some peaks above 100,000 tweets per second. That's a lot of data. GNIP and DataSift have agreements with Twitter to have access to that. DataSift offers some low-cost entry into capturing tweets. For example, what I'm going to share here in a bit about South by Southwest, I spent about $20 to get 70,000 tweets over a 20-hour period. They also offer other services that are much more expensive, and these are for big ideas, big companies, big projects. GNIP offers the similar service around access to the data stream, again for large dollars for those big ideas and big projects. ScraperWiki is a little bit different. It doesn't have access to the full Twitter fire hose. It only has access to whatever Twitter offers through their search application program interface. And so you don't get the full fire hose. You get a certain percentage of what data is being tweeted out on Twitter. But it's a lower cost option. For about $8, you can have three scans going on simultaneously. For say $10 a month, up to $20 or $30 a month, you can have more data sets, and so it's reasonably cost for smaller companies, projects, and people. And it also has a different purpose in terms of its approach, but it still captures enough of the data that one can utilize it for analysis. I personally have used DataSift and ScraperWiki. I've never used GNIP. Some summarized tools that can help. First, I'll talk about summarizing tools for Twitter, really to help turn some data from Twitter into usable chunks or help organize some of the data items for better use. For example, in Social Bro, I use Social Bro to help clean up the Twitter list. As I mentioned early on, the lists by themselves, I was able to create using the Twitter standard interface. But then over time, I want to kind of refine some of those lists. For example, if I'm looking for experts in dog training, I've initially gone through and created this dog training list with what I believe are expert, but I don't have anything to say what defines expert. So one way certainly will be is as I'm reading their material, if they're not talking about training like I thought they would be, I might take them off the list manually. But another way to define maybe an expert is kind of a rough rule of thumb would be, are they tweeting say 3 or 4 times a day? So Social Bro is a way to refine a list by saying, show me only the people who are tweeting 3 or 4 times a day, and then we'll just refine and take out the other people from that list. Another way to look at it is I could also say, I want to filter the list and drop anyone who's not tweeted anything in more than 6 months, because if they're not doing anything, I don't really want them on the list, so let's just remove them from a house cleaning point of view. Tweet Reach is a service that offers what I call spot reporting on, say, event info. It's a little bit different in the sense that for $20, I can get an inexpensive report on a specific event and see the engagement, who the top contributors are, and see what the impression reach is for that event. They also offer some more expensive monthly services to help monitor over time, kind of in the similar vein as DataSift, but they're offering to put around that some visual analytics in a less costly way than, say, DataSift would do it. There's a couple more tools that I wanted to highlight. These three tools, Fusion Tables, that's actually Google Fusion Tables, Tableau Public, and Many Eyes, are some visual analytical organizational tools that allow you to bring in data and then do some things to get useful information out of it. And they have various functionality and cost. The Google Fusion Tables is free because it's through the Google Docs, and it offers the ability to extract information, data, and maintain it privately. So I can open up and create a Google Fusion table, bring in some data from a source, say a spreadsheet or some other data source, and then manipulate it and then give some visualization around it, and then share that with people I want to share it with, or just myself, but it certainly would stay private as I wanted it to. Tableau Public and Many Eyes offer great tools for visualization, but there is a caveat that the data uploaded to their services will be made public. So there's some trade-offs there. I'll give you some examples of what they do. This is Google Fusion Table examples. There's a gallery. If you just Google the term Google Fusion Tables example gallery, you'll see what they can do. So they got mapping and then shading and some other things. Tableau Public actually is it's a much nicer tool. It only runs on Windows, so what you do is you download a piece of software for Windows, and you bring in data, and it connects with their website, and allows one to pull in data and then create charts, graphs, maps, and related interactive media that can be embedded into a blog post. So in this case, somebody was trying to get a sense of what the graffiti is like in New York City, and they pulled in the raw data that New York City collects, and they are able to give a map and a chart and a graph of where the graffiti occurs the most within the city of New York. Now, as I mentioned, that data, when it was pulled, it came from a public source, so getting it back into Tableau Public and making it public was not a problem. But you just need to remember that data pushed or data and analyzed through Tableau Public and published will be public. Many Eyes is an experiment out of an IBM lab. It's similar in nature to some of the feature functionality that Tableau Public has, but it's all web-based, so it doesn't matter if it's Windows or Macintosh. It's also a little bit restricted in some of the visual analysis that it can do, but for it is free, and so it does have some opportunity to say, hey, I want to look at some data and get a sense of what's going on. Many Eyes is a way to do that. I mentioned an example. So as I said, South by Southwest has been running, and I used DataSift to collect about a 20-hour period of the hashtag South by Southwest. As I mentioned, it gave me 70+ thousand tweets. And I wanted to find out, where are these tweets occurring? So, the data behind the actual tweets, there is some geolocation data. So I downloaded the data from DataSift. I cleaned it up. I actually had to clean it up in Excel because that was the quickest tool I knew how to do it. Because not all tweets have geolocation. While the opportunity exists, not everybody has that feature turned on, say, on their smartphone. And so out of the 70,000 tweets, only about 10,000 had geolocation information, so I just used that 10,000, and then I brought them into the Google Fusion Tables to provide a quick view of where the tweets were occurring. So this is a zoomed out Google Map list that the Fusion Table creates for me, and it shows where where people are tweeting about South by Southwest. So it's certainly global in nature. And then if I zoomed in on the city of Austin, which is where South by Southwest is actually occurring, you'll see it's there are a lot more people there, and they're kind of spread out across the city. These are probably definitely attendees. So how is that valuable? Well, what you could do is, if you were in marketing and you wanted to find out where people were about a specific hashtag and maybe have a pop-up store come up during an event, or be able to engage with them by meeting up with them because they're all clustered around one particular restaurant or conference hall. You could get over there and see what's going on. So that's a way to look at some of the data from a end use. So this is a radar. It tells you where the people are. What you do with it is your business decision. Do I want to go meet them? Do I want to do something with that location, etc. So some observations from using Twitter to create what I call an information radar process. Certainly Twitter offers data that can be used for discovery, but it's really important to spend time refining your questions before you dive into Twitter and say, hey, I want to go do something. The questions are going to really help you refine your actions on Twitter. Find tools that can help you save time. Google Fusion Tables I highly recommend because it's definitely low cost and it has some really good functionality, and Google's been improving that over the last several years. Remember, this is just a process and it will need adjusting over time. Not everything will work the way you want it to or the way you expect it. Things do change. The technologies will change. Tools today may not be usable tomorrow. Twitter might, in this particular case, since this is about Twitter a little bit, Twitter itself might change. And actually, it has over the last 7 years or so. The interface and the data and the approach to the way Twitter shares that information has changed, and the tools have had to keep up with those changes. And some tools didn't, and they had to drop away because they just had no, support for that tool after Twitter changed. Many of the techniques I also mentioned here can be applied to other social channels or digital sites. For example, we're talking about collecting data from Twitter and then doing some analysis. You could do the same thing for Facebook. Facebook offers the Facebook Insights data. They also offer behind-the-scenes programmatic interfaces or application program interfaces that you can tap into with software to pull data out and then do some analysis. Same could be for LinkedIn, Google+, or other channels. So, are there any questions? Here's one. Somebody's asked, how can you convert your goals into questions? For example, I want to find more followers in my space. What questions would I ask to find them? It's a great question around, how do I find things and using these questions that I keep talking about. One way is how do we convert goals to questions? Well, if you have some goals, you have a mental image of what you're trying to do, and if you say I'm trying to find more followers, you've also got a mental image of what those followers will look like. So if you're in business, you have a business model that has some specific terms or phrases. Use those phrases to say, I want to find some people that I might be interested in. So you could use that in search Twitter, similar in how we used pets or dogs or cats to search Twitter for Smart Animal. Something I want to kind of point out is this person's question is, I want to find more followers in my space. A key thing here is people on Twitter can follow or not follow people at their leisure. So what you're really trying to do is you're trying to find people and engage them, and ideally they will take the time to say, I like that engagement and I want to follow you. You can't make them follow you. So what is important to understand is using the terms around your business to find people and then engage with them over time can help them make a decision on whether they want to follow you. Kind of a little bit about what Twitter does behind the scenes. When you add somebody if you find somebody that's interesting and you add them to a list, they're going to get a notification in their Twitter app or in their email that says Smart Animal has added you to the dog training list, and that is an indicator to them that Smart Animal was interested in something. Another way for them to see you in some fashion and to try and make a better decision of to follow you or not is if you retweet something of theirs, they're going to see that. A more direct way is if you answer questions that they have maybe posed, or if they're having a conversation or have made a comment on Twitter and you're able to address or help answer that question, they'll see those responses, and that's maybe a deeper level of engagement that might entice them to say, hey, I want to follow back and learn more about you as a business. So converting your goals, you have a business goal and a business objective, you have some terms and terminology, use Twitter to search out and find people similar, and then use that opportunity to engage with them over time, and maybe they will become followers of yours. I'm looking at see if there's any other questions. Somebody actually asked, I want to get better at return on investment for participating in Twitter. I'm not a return on investment expert, so my answers are going to be kind of very low level. I have to look at return on investment. Does using Twitter save me time? So if I have a question and I go to Twitter and I spend an hour and I have those same questions and I go to, say, Facebook or LinkedIn, is Twitter giving me back what I'm looking for in an hour, but on Facebook or LinkedIn it takes me 2 hours? That return on investment is definitely worth it because I've only spent an hour. So you have to kind of look at it from that way. How much time are the questions you've posed getting answered relatively well on Twitter, or are other channels better? If you want a better return on investment answer, I highly recommend the Marketing White Belt book by Christopher S. Penn. It's in Amazon. It's in the Amazon bookstore. It's an ebook. It's about $10. He has a chapter on return on investment in general for marketing and media activities, not just about Twitter, but across marketing and media. So I highly recommend that, the Marketing White Belt book. Somebody just asked, can I sort people on Twitter by their geography in an easy way? So I would say on Twitter, on the standard Twitter interface, you can't sort the people that you've put in lists into geographies. You can do some searches regionally. If you look on the left in the interface, it shows trends. Let's see if I can get back there real quick. Scanning, quickly. Oh, here it is. If you look in the standard Twitter interface today, on the lower left, it says trends. And it actually says, in this particular example, it says Kansas City trends. You could change that location there and see trends that are popping up for your location. So you would get trends that are occurring where you picked. And so there's a geolocation filter in that way. If you're looking for maybe people in your list, another way would be to use the Social Bro list tool that I mentioned. I'm getting back to that so you can see here. So Social Bro allows you to do some geography filtering. So you could have a list of people and then use Social Bro to help organize your people into, say, East Coast, West Coast. And that might be a way. Certainly DataSift, GNIP, and ScraperWiki. Well, I'm not sure about ScraperWiki. I know DataSift does it. DataSift actually brings back this is another way to do it. So if you said, I want to do a search on people who have used this South by Southwest hashtag, I get back a lot of data for each tweet. And so I get back the geography of the geolocation of the tweet itself, but I also get back the geolocation of the person where they have self-claimed the geography. You could export that data and then sort through the geolocation of the Twitter user themselves and say, I'm interested in East Coast people. You'd have to figure out what East Coast means to you because they don't define it that way. But then you could say, here are the 15 or 20 people who appear to be on the East Coast, and I'm going to pull them out and I'm going to create a new Twitter list of East Coast people. That would be a way to sort out people by geography. So DataSift has the data. I'm sure GNIP does. ScraperWiki doesn't have it specifically for the user. It's just offering scraping the tweets themselves and some other things. Getting back to the question page here. Somebody asked, I want a better understanding of where and how the data goes and is used. I'm not quite sure how that is meaning, but if you said, if we talk about Twitter and you use Twitter and where does it go, when you tweet, certainly Twitter captures that data in their vast database of tweets. And then it is shared and sold. You have to remember the terms of service. Twitter is a pretty open network. There is, with few exceptions, most people who tweet know that their tweets are going to be public and they're okay with that. Some people do use Twitter for, they keep their tweets private. And that makes it cumbersome because it's really just you have to let friends in, and for some people that works great, but majority of people use Twitter knowing it's going to be public. So when Twitter gets it in, gets the tweet in and all the other information, they've stored it and then they sell it back to services like DataSift and GNIP. It also other services tap into Twitter through various channels directly and are able to pull in data. So companies like Hootsuite or some other services like TweetReach are able to pull in that data, and they then can utilize that data. So hopefully that helps answer where and how the data goes and is used. There are research companies and research labs across the United States who work with Twitter and other companies like DataSift and GNIP to do massive research on context and sentiment and marketing activities. One person actually looked at several million tweets to see if there was any correlation between a stock price and its mention on Twitter, and was able to find and discover that stock prices could be predicted to some level of certainty by using the data on Twitter. Some other people have been looking into, can I get a better sense of like the spread of disease by looking at the comments of Twitter around I'm sick, I've got a cold, I need to get some NyQuil. Some people have looked at that and say, is Twitter have enough information for doing research? So other people are gathering that data for research purposes. Kind of a side note, there are Twitter robots, you could call them. These are accounts whose job it is to automatically sift through tweets, and if they see a specific term or phrase, they'll do something with it. An interesting one that I had occur to me in the last week is when I was publicizing this webinar, I kept saying, webinar on building your Twitter radar. There's actually a Twitter account called PR Webinar and another account called Webinar, both owned by the same company, and their job is to scan for tweets that have the word webinar in it and retweet it as a service to those people hosting a webinar. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That's a robot. That's all software driven. Somebody asked about, how can I use Twitter for networking? Kind of reiterating what I've already said, Twitter can be used for networking in the sense that you're trying to find people of like mind or maybe similar interest, or some things that might make a good connection. For networking purposes, you could say, I'm interested in all the dog trainers, and you see who they are on Twitter, and you start to engage them in conversation on Twitter, maybe in other social channels. So there's a bit of, that's certainly building up your network. One of the things that I do is for Truffle Media's Twitter account is I develop a series of lists focused around swine, beef, poultry, dairy, crops, ag specialty, organizations, some technology, environment, and over the last 2 or 3 years I've kind of collected those lists and curated them in some fashion to make them better in terms of they're focused on those topic areas, and then I've reached out to certain people over time to see about interviews and meeting up with them at events. So there's a bit of networking development going on there too. I don't see any other questions coming up, so again, I just wanted to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will get published when it's completed. Also, again, I wanted to remind you of the resource page at radar.hackpad.com. I'll be updating the info on that page certainly through the end of March. After the webinar is done, you will be receiving a webinar feedback survey link that has 2 questions on it, and I would love for you to fill that out and click send so that I get some feedback on how the webinar worked for you. As always, if you needed to get a hold of myself, again, my name is John Blue. I'm with Truffle Media Networks. I manage the @Twitter account, or the @Truffle Media account on Twitter. You can certainly call me. The info at trufflemedia.com comes into my queue, and we have the trufflemedia.com/Facebook account. Again, thanks again for joining, and I appreciate it, and have a great day.